referred to within, referred to in the real estate industry as a GAD, or Government Affairs Director, but I work independently, so I'm not a GAD. I'm an advocate. And specifically, AB 38 was a bill that was actually, we tracked it, and we tracked it pretty closely back in 2018, 2019 is when it actually got formally introduced. And it was signed by the governor October of that year, chaptered as 391. And essentially, AB 38 is just another step in a long series of steps that have been taken by the state of California to address the ever-present and growing danger of uncontrolled wildfire and the impact it has on individuals, lives, property, the economy, and most importantly, for those of you buying and selling real estate, the ability to obtain and retain insurance at a reasonable price if you plan to carry a mortgage or want to be able to replace your home. So AB 38 was introduced by Assemblymember Wood, and it was designed specifically to speak to that if you live in one of these high or very high fire hazard severity zones, there's a long acronym for it, but I haven't figured out a way to say it like this, but it's, very high fire hazard severity zones is key. That you have to provide documentation to the buyer of a real property, and it's the seller. And this is important to remember as professionals in the industry. While you want to assist in the transaction, I mean, that's the value added that you bring. The fact is that this is a seller's requirement to any individual that ends up putting an earnest offer on the home or is interested in the home. And they have to disclose that it's in such a zone and that that it is in compliance with wildfire protection measures, or, and it isn't or, a local vegetation management ordinance, or if you haven't been able to obtain either of those, enter into an agreement. The seller enters into an agreement with the buyer, pursuant to which the buyer will obtain documentation of compliance as provided. And to me, that's the key point, is it's a safety valve to ensure that sales are not unduly encumbered by having to not only have an inspection completed, but have compliance completed prior to sale. That is not to say that we don't encourage people to do their inspection and compliance activities recurrently, because as you all probably know, defensible space is a community-wide endeavor. Your defensible space is only as good as your neighbor's. If you don't have community-wide coverage, then your home will still burn, even if you're a good faith actor, if the homes around you are out of compliance. So the mere fact of having your home transferring title is really just an additional lever that's utilized by the state and local entities to ensure compliance, or at least to trigger or lever that compliance with either the owner that is selling, or under a written agreement with the new owner that is buying within a prescribed period of time, so that it doesn't linger on forever. And because of that, along with a section that will go into effect on 2025, which talks about if you've had a final inspection report, you have to submit that copy to the seller. And also, AB 38 speaks to home hardening measures and disclosing whether or not your home has any home hardening, fire resistant measures that have been put into place. And if so, list them. If there are other things that could be done that you are aware of, then you are also encouraged to include those. And so essentially, the reason this impacts our area so significantly is the Bates bill way back in the early 90s um, uh, demanded that CAL FIRE map zone two specific areas, wildland areas that are in state responsibilities, SRAs. And those are areas in which the state of California has primary responsibility for the suppression of fires. And there are a lot of SRA areas in our region. And the reason it's so complex is it's not every area in our region. We have local jurisdictions that have direct control, but we also have areas that are within the SRA boundaries. CAL FIRE is the essentially the first responder, if you will, of record. And if you have on your tax bill an SRA add-on, that's a good clue that you are in fact in an SRA area. And so that's one reference point you could use, but it's also good to perhaps reference a title company, and do their own search. And of course, it's the due diligence of the buyer and the seller, especially the buyer, to make sure that they know. And then the second area that the CAL FIRE mandate under the Bates bill put forward was that very high fire hazard severity zones have to, in cooperation with local authorities that have local areas of responsibility or LRAs, that they too have to map and identify. So if you're in a CAL FIRE, very high hazard area, or if you're in a Truckee Fire District, North Tahoe Fire District, Alpine, Squaw, Donner Summit, pick your poison, Meeks Bay, all of the local fire districts that have local responsibilities, LRAs, still will show up in the CAL FIRE mapping. The CAL FIRE mapping, and if you just want a general sense of it, CAL FIRE, if you go to their website, I wish I could just put it in the chat, but I don't have it in front of me. But CAL FIRE has the map statewide, and you can burrow down as narrowly as you wish to figure out where your particular property is in reference to those zones. Under a bunch of bills, Senate Bill X-129, which was the extraordinary session of the Assembly, they were asked to improve the SRA boundary areas, and especially to match them to parcel lines, because a lot of people were complaining that their properties didn't really correspond mapping-wise with parcels. So at least CAL FIRE is saying that when you're looking at SRA data, use parcel boundaries to ensure that you have correctly determined whether or not you're in or out of an SRA area. And CAL FIRE does review this map every 5 years, but they also will review it on a spot basis if, in point of fact, you've had reason to believe you've been mismapped either by CAL FIRE or by your local agency's input to CAL FIRE. So the essential question that keeps coming back to me from y'all is, so what do I do? Or what do I tell my buyer and seller to do given AB 38? Because AB 38 was intended in good faith by CAR and others to help standardize the idea that you disclose this, because many areas of California, it's not just us, at Malibu, think of all the places where wildfires have been raging over the past 5 years. In fact, we've been relatively good comparatively. I was just talking with CAL FIRE a few weeks back, and our fire seasons have been relatively manageable so far, knock on wood. And so the essential issue is, what do I disclose? How do I disclose it? And is the disclosure that CAR has put together in this regard, referencing AB 38 as its trigger, sufficient? And this becomes the issue that gave me an ulcer. It's because within AB 38, it says that the disclosure that you use that has been demanded, which is shown in CAR's form, is adequate, unless, with the caveat, unless your local area, i.e., if you live within the district boundaries of Truckee Fire. If they have created an ordinance that either supersedes, is equal to, but different than, or in other ways expands upon the requirements of AB 38, then yes, AB 38 still applies, but so does whatever the local jurisdiction has codified under local ordinance. And so for me to tell you blanketly how to disclose would be ill-advised from a professional standpoint, from a keeping my job standpoint, and from you not taking me into joint and several liability litigation when the civil suit arrives eventually. So I'm not going to tell you how to disclose it. It's not my position. I wouldn't want to. But the essence of it is, I think, in my opinion, is to reference the CAR fire disclosure piece. And then on top of that, recognizing that many, if not most or all, local jurisdictions likely have ordinances that additionally speak to measures that must be undertaken before, during, or in a prescribed time after the close of sale. So that way, it doesn't matter if you're selling in Tahoe City or in Glenshire or, the Sierra Summit, that type of disclosure is specific enough that you're telling the buyer there are local, ordinances that you need to look into, and that this general disclosure covers AB 38 type issues, but there are going to be additional requirements that you will be asked to comply with either before, during, or in a prescribed period after. So that's the end of my very brief presentation.
Okay, thank you, John. Does anybody have any questions for John before we let Jana from CAR start talking about the disclosure? If you have something, there is a reaction button on the bottom of your Zoom. You can raise your hand. You click on that little smiley face. I'll quickly go through and see if anybody has a hand raised. All right, seeing none.
Yeah.
John, I'm going to go ahead and mute you and turn it over to Jana.
All right. Well, that was a excellent explanation of AB 38, which, like John said, is so complicated. Anytime we struggle with this at CAR a lot, where there's a state law that attempts to impose requirements across California, but like he said, there's so many, especially in your location, but all around the state, different fire protection districts, cities, counties with their own rules. And so our challenge at CAR is, well, how do we create tools for you to help you comply with this in your transactions, to help you help your clients comply with their obligations, while with the understanding of there's only so much we can do. So I know a lot of people look at, say, the FHDS form and they're like, there's all these options and it's filled with all this stuff. And it's like, well, there kind of has to be, because there's a whole lot of buckets that your transaction could possibly fall into. Actually, if I could, I think I'd probably make most sense to share my screen and we can all look at the form together. If we want to do that, let me see if I can. All right. Okay. Is that working? Can we see, Sue, my?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right. So the FHDS form is called Fire Hardening and Defensible Space. It's been around since 2021, and it's basically divided into 3 parts. Part 1 tries to help buyers and sellers understand what this law is and what it applies to. Part 2 deals with the home fire hardening portion, which I'll touch on very briefly. I think that's kind of the easy part compared to defensible space, which can be so complicated. And then part 3 deals with defensible space. So starting with part 1, talks about, when do you have to comply with these laws? When does your transaction subject to AB 38, and therefore is this form going to be required in your transaction? Well, the short answer is when the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Technically, this law falls under section 1102 of the Civil Code, which means it has the same applicability and exceptions as the TDS, for example, the transfer disclosure statement. So there's certain sellers who may be technically exempt from filling out this form, probate administrators, certain trustees, things like that. But the really important thing to remember is nobody's exempt from complying with defensible space. And for the most part, local rules don't have these exceptions. And so, if the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, chances are these rules are going to be applying to you or your transactions, and this form should be used. Now, there's one sort of twist as far as when the home fire hardening disclosure is required besides defensible space. Technically, sellers only have to provide the disclosure related to the home hardening for properties that were built before January 1st, 2010. Older building codes, older properties, less likely to have home hardening features. So technically, if the property was built after January 1st, 2010, the seller does not have to fill out portion 2 about the home fire hardening. But doesn't matter year built for defensible space, right? Home hardening has to do with features on the structure to make it more fire resilient and safer. But defensible space, it doesn't matter when the structure was built. We're talking about the area around the structure and maintaining fire safety practices on the grounds as opposed to on the structure itself. And then finally, the biggest question we got for the first couple of years from a lot of agents and consumers was, well, how do I know if the property is located in one of these fire zones? Now, as John also touched on, it's a growing portion of the state, right? Much more of the state, unfortunately, every year. And when the maps get redone, which they've been done recently, we tend to see these fire zones expand. So they've had a good couple years, some wetter winters, but we all, remember over the past 5-10 years, crazy fire seasons, the fire zones tend to get bigger and bigger. That being said, it's actually not everywhere in the state. There are places in the state that are not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. There is the map, fire.ca.gov, especially fire.ca.gov/dspace. That's where you can go and look at the CAL FIRE information. And I don't have the exact link for the map either, but that's one of the places where you can find it. And also when you are in a transaction, the NHD report, the natural hazard zone report that you're getting from that NHD provider, that's going to tell you if the property is located in one of these zones. That actually, you might have noticed, is a change that happened on January 1st of this year. For the past couple of years, the way the NHD form was set up, you could usually, but not always tell if the property was in one of these zones because there was very high zones and then state wildland zones, which included a moderate as well as high and very high. Well, now, due to some work from CAR and some other people, the NHD report was updated. So there is actually a checkbox on that form now that says, is the property in a high or very high zone? And then if yes, it actually breaks it down into exactly which zone it is, high or very high, state responsibility, local responsibility. So that NHD report is going to be a really great resource for a seller to say, am I in one of these zones? Do I need to comply with these laws? All right, so that's all laid out in paragraph 1 of this form. Paragraph 2, like I said, this is kind of the easy part, is the fire hardening disclosure. 2 aspects of this law as it currently stands. One is this required notice. Whenever you see something in our form or any form that has all capital letters like that, quotes around it, that means that the law said the buyer needs to receive this information, telling them the property is located in a fire zone and that home hardening features are important and where they can get more information about them. And then finally, 2B, this is the seller disclosure element. This is asking sellers, are you aware of the following features that could make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers? Because that's the whole thing with home fire hardening, is in the case of a wildfire, an ember can travel up to a mile ahead of a fire, land on the property, and potentially ignite it. And having home hardening features can limit that likelihood. So this is asking sellers, are you aware of missing home hardening features, vulnerabilities? Now, the thing for the seller to remember is that this disclosure, like almost all of our other disclosures, or the disclosures here in California, are based on seller's actual knowledge. So seller, are you aware? So some of these things, the seller's probably aware. Seller, do you know, are you aware if your roof is made of untreated wood shingles or shakes? Are you aware if you have single paned or untempered windows? if you have combustible landscaping within 5 feet of the home, these are things that the seller is probably going to be aware of. Now, is the seller aware of eaves, soffit, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch? Maybe less so. It's going to depend on the seller, right? But they need to be reading these questions and considering them and answering them in good faith based on their actual knowledge. All right, that's the easy part. Now let's talk about how this FHDS form addresses defensible space. And just like we discussed at the very beginning, there's kind of 2 portions to this requirement, right? There's a disclosure obligation, and then there's an actual obligation of one party or the other to take responsibility for ensuring the property is in compliance with those defensible space laws. And the options for that are going to depend on the rules of where the property is actually located. So the very first question here in paragraph 3A, the property is or is not subject to a local vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space around the property. And you'll notice this isn't asking seller, do you know? It's saying the property is or is not. So the seller really does need to know if the property is in a fire protection district or other city or county that is subject to one of these local ordinances. How can they know that? Well, reaching out to the local fire department, fire protection district, potentially CAL FIRE, depending on the area, is going to be the way to go. Many sellers, especially in these specialized areas, probably already know if they're subject to inspections, if they've been through this before. But if the seller genuinely has no idea, looking online at the websites for the local fire departments, reaching out with a phone call, that's really going to be the best way to resolve any confusion in that regard. Second part, now sellers disclosing whether or not the property, as far as they know, is currently in compliance. Now, this is based on seller's knowledge. So they've already said yes or no, the property is in a local fire zone. Now they're telling the seller, now the seller is telling the buyer whether or not their property currently complies with whatever requirements apply to them, local or state. And it defaults to the seller being unaware. So it defaults to saying, I haven't had an inspection done lately. I don't know if as of today, my property is in compliance with defensible space rules. But the seller might know. So there's 2 options, right? Paragraph 3B2 says the property is in compliance with the applicable state or local defensible space law. And if under the state law, you have to have a certificate of compliance or documentation of compliance that was obtained in the past 6 months. Local rules can have different requirements about that. And so if the seller has that inspection, maybe they decided to do it as a pre-sale inspection, maybe they just happen to have it done. Maybe the fire department comes around on an annual or otherwise regular basis and does inspections, and that's happened and the seller passed and they have the document. Great. Then they're going to check 3B2, give that copy of the proof of compliance to the buyer, and that's going to be the sort of best case scenario for any possible transaction here. On the flip side, there could be a chance that the seller happens to know that the property is not in compliance. Maybe they had one of those inspections come through. They got a letter telling them they weren't in compliance. There's things they need to fix, and they haven't done it, right? That's okay in the short term. Sometimes that happens, but they have to tell the buyer that as well and give whatever documentation they have, stating how they're not in compliance, and give that to the buyer so that everybody is on the same page. All right. Now, once all that's said and done, we come to the final portion here, which is paragraph 3C. Who is going to be responsible for making sure the property is in compliance with the defensible space law? So the default under 3C1 is for when there is no local ordinance, only the state law applies, and it defaults to saying, buyer, you're going to obtain compliance within 1 year after close of escrow per California state requirements. And the reason why this is written this way is because, like we discussed at the beginning, AB 38 basically says for properties subject to the state law, the seller should make sure their property is in compliance, because all people who live in high fire zones, very high fire zones, should keep their properties in defensible space compliance all the time. It's an important safety issue. But if for some reason the seller has not done that, then in order to comply with the law, buyer and seller have to enter into a written agreement where the buyer accepts responsibility and agrees to do it within 1 year after closing. So that's what's happening here in 3C1. Now, if the state law doesn't apply, then we have a bunch of other options that could apply. So like we also discussed, it's not just there's a state requirement or there's a local requirement, A or B. There's the state requirements, or there could be a local requirement, and even the local requirements can vary wildly from one another. Some might say, yeah, you're supposed to be in compliance, but we just check on a random basis, or we come by once a year or something like that. Or the local requirement could say, you're supposed to be in compliance with our rules, and we're going to check when you sell the property. And it might say seller has to do it. It might say either buyer or seller can do it. And depending on what the law allows for and what the parties then agree to is going to govern what gets checked in this section here. So if there is a local rule that says, hey, you're supposed to bring the property into compliance when the property is sold, but you can do it before closing or within 30, 60, 90, some time period after closing, then if the buyer is willing to say, okay, I'll do it after closing, then checkbox number 2 here would be okay. A lot of areas, you're going to be more along the lines of 3C3, which is we have a local ordinance, but it's not tied to the sale. You're just supposed to always be in compliance, and we check periodically. And the buyer might say, okay, after closing, I'll make sure I get into compliance with it whenever the next inspection comes around. And then options 4, 5, and 6 are for when the seller is going to be the one to take responsibility. Now, there's sort of 3 default options for when the seller is going to be taking responsibility under the form. One, or the first one here in 3C4, is when there is what we call a true point of sale requirement, which is there's a law that says, hey, seller, before you transfer title to your property, you're going to have an inspection done, and you're going to fix any out of compliant issues, and you're going to make sure the property complies with defensible space. And so if that's the rule, and there are some fire protection districts where that's the rule, then seller, it just is what it is. You're going to do that because that's what your local law says you have to do. 3C5 is for the situation I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is great news, best case scenario. Property's already in compliance. I had an inspection 2 months ago. Here's my letter saying I'm good to go, already done. Or the final option is sort of the negotiable option in a scenario where the buyer says, I know technically I could, under the law, agree to take responsibility, but I don't want to. Seller, I want, just like a buyer can request seller to, obtain termite clearance, they can say, seller, I want you to be in compliance with defensible space prior to close. I don't have the time or money or willingness to take care of it after closing. So seller, as a negotiable item of the contract, I want you to agree to obtain documentation of compliance before closing. And that can be agreed to in 3C6. So those are the very wide range of options. And like we were discussing earlier, we do our best with a one size fits all form like this. We try to account for all of the situations that might apply, but what the actual rules are, what the steps are that have to be taken, how you schedule an inspection, what kind of trees have to be cut down, that sort of thing. I think we're going to discuss that in a little bit, but that's something that's going to have to be determined by the seller and maybe by the buyer as part of their due diligence if they're agreeing to take this on after closing as well. And then finally, there's a place here to note who is the local agency. If there has been an inspection done and who keeps those on file, who conducts the inspections, and there's a place here to indicate who that is and where they can be contacted. And then finally, this is only a if applicable section. If the seller has a final inspection report dedicated to either of these things, addressing home hardening or defensible space, and seller has a copy, they're going to attach it. Or again, if they don't, they'll tell the buyer where to get it if one of those has been obtained. So that's the FHDS form. I know it's a little bit complicated, but like I said, it's kind of our attempt to address the various scenarios you might get into depending on where the property is located. All right, and that's my summary of the form. I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, I think you're muted, Sue.
You know, you're doing this so long and you still do it. So if anybody has any questions, like I said before, that you can click on the little smiley face reactions and raise your hand. Or you can type something in the chat. If you have a question for Jana, I'll take a quick look through everyone and see if anybody has a hand raised. I see Laura. You want to unmute yourself?
Laura, question?
I see you have a hand raised.
Oh,
Oh.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can, yes.
Okay, sorry. So my question is about townhouses and condos. And who, when the homeowner association is responsible for the grounds and doing defensible space, there's
Yeah.
confusion about if it's 4 units, is it 4 units for the whole complex? Is it a building of 4 units or less? How does that work and how do we disclose it?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. This is one of those laws that happens sometimes. It's like I said, it's written under section 1102 of the Civil Code. So it applies to residential 1 to 4 units, including things like condos and townhouses. Now, unfortunately, for things like condos and townhouses, sellers often don't have, they may not have the knowledge. They often don't even have the ability to take any action for the area around the property. And the defensible space laws typically address property that's under the control of the seller. So, the seller, legally speaking, individually doesn't have any obligation, or like I said, even the ability to go out and cut down trees or anything, because it's going to be on the HOA. And so unfortunately, the law still includes those types of properties. So you still want to have that FHDS form in your file and be a part of the transaction, but it's going to be a matter of reaching out to the HOA and just making sure that they are on top of it, essentially. And it's going to, be done they're the ones who are responsible for complying and taking whatever actions needed. And it's just going to be a matter of making sure they're on top of it, and something the buyer probably should be concerned about, because if major steps need to be taken, it's like anything with an HOA, that they might have to come out of, there could be assessments or things associated with it. But typically it's going to be a requirement that just says, hey, buyer, you should check with the HOA about this and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. If it is, so that's for the scenario where you're selling like 1 unit in a multi-unit building. If it's like a duplex or a fourplex or something where all of them are being sold, well, then it's just the seller, who has the access to that area is going to be dealing with it. But when it's an individual unit like that, it's going to be a matter of just getting the HOA in the loop, and they're who's ultimately responsible.
Great. Anybody else have any questions? Just taking a quick look. Any hands raised? Jana, you're gonna get off easy today, girl.
I'll take it.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And next up, we're gonna have Maria Marsh from Truckee Fire.
Hi, everybody. Sue, I wanted to point out that the chat feature is currently disabled. So I think that is something that on your side as the presentation owner maybe has to be enabled. And maybe that's why John and Jana have gotten off so easy so far.
I have the chat preview. I don't see anything in the chat. I don't see that it's disabled in any way.
Yeah, I am seeing as chat disabled. Sometimes
Disabled.
there's a Zoom restriction where only like hosts can access it. So that might be the case.
Anybody have any idea where I would turn that off? Let me see, chat. Show chat previews. There's like only one selection here. Let me look right here real quick. Can chat with, here we go. Everyone, how about that? Does that work?
Yep, that fixed it.
All righty. So go ahead. If you guys have any questions, you want to put them in the chat, go right ahead. And I will go ahead and Maria, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, great. I will share my screen here. I'm not great at staying on track of what I'm talking about, so I made myself a presentation, and hopefully stay as well on time as John and Jana did. I might skip over a couple of things to sort of stress or highlight, spend some more time on some items that I think came up from what Jana and John covered, but the link to my slides will be available following the presentation through the TSBOR website. So everything that you see here, don't feel like you missed something if I skip over a slide. So first and foremost, just want to introduce myself. I've worked with a lot of you via email and phone so far, but I am Maria Marsh. I'm the Wildfire Prevention Specialist at Truckee Fire. Here is my contact information, and I'm probably the primary one that you guys will be interacting with through the course of whatever work you're doing in real estate transactions and defensible space inspections. What I'm going to talk about today is specific to within the Truckee Fire Protection District. So this is very informative for me as well to hear from Jana and John, because the slice of pie that I'm familiar with is specifically Truckee Fire's interpretation of the state code in conjunction with our local ordinances. And in some ways that is going to differ from well, I guess I can say I'll be giving you some more specific direction as to where inspections within our district fit within all of the options that Jana outlined. Very quickly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Measure T, which was the tax measure passed in 2021 by Truckee Fire Protection District voters. It is what funds our entire office, our staff, and a myriad of programs that we offer in the community, many of which you guys are familiar with, either in your professional capacity or as residents within the fire district. Our defensible space inspections, our seasonal inspectors, our curbside green waste pickup program, a home hardening rebate, a lot of fuel reduction projects going on around the district. So information on all of that is available on our website, and that is mostly for a different presentation though. Green waste disposal options, also funded by Measure T, and this is something that many of you might be directing your residents toward if they're doing the work themselves. All this info also available on our website. John mentioned the reason for the defensible space codes and the reason for the work being important. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but national trends point to Truckee and our sort of greater fire district area being significantly higher risk of wildfire than most of the rest of the country. So while the code applies to the 4291 and the state code applies to all of California, there's a reason that we as a community are so focused on it. And then we talk a lot about defensible space, but I also want to just sort of give a general idea of what it actually is. The purpose of defensible space and the idea behind it is reducing the amount of what we would call fuel, pretty much anything that can burn or spread fire, reducing the fuel and creating greater separation between the fuels so as to reduce the spread and intensity of fire within our communities. Defensible space code, for the most part, John covered sort of the important aspects here. There is a lot of code that relates to defensible space, and some of it is sort of more directly supportive of the inspections that we conduct. So let me turn on, I have a pointer here. Let's see. Laser pointer, there we go. PRC 4291 is the state code. This has actually been in effect since the 60s. So defensible space is not a new concept in the state of California. Also, the Truckee Fire Protection District in 2012 passed its own ordinance relating to defensible space. These are the primary guiding codes as to our inspections themselves and what items we're identifying on the inspections. Then we have code that is specifically related to defensible space in the context of real estate transactions. We commonly refer to AB 38, Assembly Bill 38. The actual code number that John and Jana both mentioned is that Civil Code 1102.19. So colloquially, we're always going to call it AB 38, but if you go looking for the actual written code, there's a different number. AB 38 was passed in 2021. In fact, Truckee Fire passed a real estate defensible space ordinance in 2019. So we were sort of ahead of the curve in that sense in terms of requiring inspection and disclosure of the status of property's compliance with 4291 before the state required it across the board. We operate now under a intersection, if you will, of those two codes. And I will try to sort of give some clarity without telling you how to complete the forms, because I'm not a real estate expert and I don't, we're not qualified to tell you whether your property, is subject to AB 38. But I can tell you that 01/2019 requires that pretty much every property within the fire district needs to be inspected and disclosed. So whereas other districts may allow for a property owner to just say that they don't know the status of their property, within the Truckee Fire District, it is required that an inspection be conducted and the status of that inspection be disclosed to the buyer. And if you think about it, well, I'll tell you that from our general inspections, we have about a 10% first-time compliance rate within our district. So if somebody doesn't know if their property is compliant, chances are good it's not. So every transaction, every property transaction should be having a defensible space inspection so that both seller and buyer know the degree to which work needs to be conducted. Sometimes it is smaller scale. Oftentimes it's more work than people anticipate, especially if they had inspections, from CAL FIRE 5 years ago. You might have a resident that told you, oh, I was just inspected last year and it was fine. We hear that too often, and it turns out it was a one-pager inspection from CAL FIRE that doesn't address the level of detail or the degree of inspection that is now sort of the standard within our district and what people are required to accomplish in order to have a compliant report. So who and when are responsible for defensible space? Pretty much everybody all the time. And that's the short way of addressing it. And this might bring up the question, well, shouldn't all of these properties already be in compliance before a property sale? Why are they being targeted at this point in time? It's a moving target in order to, yes, we would also like to have every property within the district be compliant with defensible space code. With the passage of Measure T, we gained funding from the community in order to implement our division and our blanket inspection program. In 2022, we initiated our 3-year inspection cycle. So at the end of this season, every property within our district will have received at minimum a curbside inspection notice. That being said, a lot of those people won't access their curbside inspection and won't follow through on getting further inspection. So hopefully, after a couple of cycles, we will overall see a movement towards improved compliance. across our district and see greater compliance on first inspection and a lot of properties that are already compliant by the time they are listing for sale. At present, though, it's almost never the case. So all of that being said, how is Truckee Fire supporting homeowners, our local residents, and you guys as real estate professionals to support your clients in complying with these pretty hard to pin down disclosure and inspection requirements? We are, so as I said, we're operating under both the state code and this intersection between the state code and our local ordinance. So our directive is generally that every property needs an inspection prior to the real estate transaction. And yes, ideally the work is being completed prior to the real estate transaction, and it's a compliant report that's being disclosed to the buyer. We do allow for that 1 year of leeway, let's say, for a buyer to take responsibility for bringing the property into compliance. That being said, I will point out that we looked at 4291 and our existing ordinance that dates back to 2012. Every property should already be in compliance. So there's a little overlap and squidginess about the fact that we're giving them a year to bring into compliance something that should already be in compliance. It doesn't happen often, but there may be a situation where we receive a complaint on a property that turns out is in pretty hazardous condition. And Truckee Fire does, under those codes, basically reserve the right to require that the property be mitigated sooner than within that year or sooner than a real estate transaction. So far, that has not been a situation for me. And it's not something that we would undertake without communicating. Our sort of entire position within the Wildfire Prevention District is that we're here because the community wanted us to be here. We're here to support and enable the community to move closer to being resilient. So we're not interested in, undermining real estate transactions. We're here to support them. And that means in a lot of cases, allowing that leeway for property owners and new buyers to bring the property into compliance. So our inspections assess for compliance with local and state code. They're also free of charge. At present, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The reports that we provide fulfill the disclosure requirements, either confirming compliance or disclosing the outstanding violations. There are detailed information on how to bring the property into compliance, and our reports also include home hardening features, both vulnerabilities and resilient features that can inform how the owner completes that FHDS form. The report is valid for 6 months. We do sort of, again, reserve the right to allow for some leeway depending on, seasonality and that sort of thing. But you guys all live up here, that a tree can go from live to dead in 6 months. And that's not something that we want to overlook or be dismissive of, how much can change on a property. So we generally are sticking to that 6-month validity. If you have questions or particular issues, you can always reach out to us. I think all of you that I've worked with know that we do our best to accommodate you guys and support requests. And you guys have been very reasonable. So no one has sort of abused our ability to be accommodating. The question we get most often, which sounds like it's the same for Jana, is does it need an inspection? So what I will answer from the interpretation of Truckee Fire of properties within our district. The short answer is it's up to the owner or their legal representative to determine if it's subject to the real estate requirements. But the slightly more helpful answer is to return with a couple of questions to you. Does the owner of the unit, for example, of a condo, have right or responsibility to make changes to the exterior of the building or to the vegetation or landscaping surrounding it? If their property boundaries are clearly within the walls of the structure, then I, as the fire district representative, am comfortable telling you that if I went to do an inspection, there is no vegetation within the walls of the building, so there won't be anything on the inspection. So in that circumstance, they don't need an inspection. More difficult for me to identify are situations like a townhome where the parcel boundaries do show that the ownership of that parcel includes ownership of space surrounding the building. In those cases, if you ask me, I will still come and do an inspection. And then it's up to the owner, and their representatives that they're working with, if they hand that report to the homeowners association or not. And because the actual determination of who's going to bring it into compliance is up to you guys, we're not going to hold up a sale because a homeowners association hasn't brought the entire community into compliance. So that's not a situation that you guys need to worry about, but always a question we're willing to answer. We're always happy to come and do an inspection in those situations because, as Jana said, it's good for everybody to know what the actual risks are. It's not just about whose responsibility it is, but if you are buying a unit in a community that hasn't been upkeeping its defensible space, then maybe that's a risk that the buyer needs to know about, or they'll be prompted to engage with the homeowners association to fulfill what their obligations are. Undeveloped lots are the other question we get a lot, and I will cover a little bit further, but Truckee Fire's Defensible Space Code does have a good neighbor clause, which means that you're responsible for 100 feet of defensible space, even if the structure that it's in reference to is on a neighboring lot. So yes, vacant lots are still subject to defensible space inspections if there's a structure within 100 feet. And again, if you aren't sure about that, you can always reach out to us and we're happy to give you, again, our interpretation of the circumstances. The other question that does it need an inspection often brings up is if there's an existing report on file, is that sufficient? And again, I'll respond with questions. Was it a full access inspection? And I'll tell you where to check for that. And did it take place within 6 months of the transaction date? Let me just check my time here. I know I'm got a lot to tell you guys. So very quickly, I mentioned that we have a 3-year blanket inspection cycle. The majority of those inspections are going to be curbside inspections. Requested inspections where someone with authorization has granted us full access to the property are going to be the full access inspections. You can identify this with the online access or the printed report. It will tell you the last evaluation date and whether the inspection was curbside only or full access. Very basics of scheduling: the owner or their representative requests the inspection. We visit the property. We need to have access behind any gates or fences. We don't need access to the interior of the building. We advise whomever booked the appointment that the inspection is complete, provide access to the digital report. And I generally advise either within that communication, or now it's possible to identify on the report itself whether it is eligible for photo resolution. A couple quick tips for us in particular in scheduling. We do strongly recommend that you get the inspection before buyer and seller enter into negotiations as to who's going to take responsibility for it. And our inspection is exterior only, which means that if you need an inspection for an STR permit or a certificate of occupancy, our inspection, the real estate inspection, isn't sufficient. Still through Truckee Fire, you can book an STR or a construction inspection, and that includes the fire and life safety aspects of the inspection, plus defensible space. So if you consider the Venn diagram of inspection types, their inspections can account for STR and construction, and that defensible space inspection can be used for real estate purposes, whereas my real estate inspection cannot be used for STR permitting or construction certificate of occupancy purposes. One last thing, Tahoe Donner conducts their own property sale inspections, and they are going to join us as well in a little bit to talk about their specifics. I'm going to skip over some of our specific scheduling quick tips. For those of you that are familiar with that form, you can double back and see what my guidance there is. Our inspections and per our code are looking to 100 feet from a structure or a property line. However, we're also looking at that good neighbor clause for 100 feet from a neighboring structure. And the same applies on a vacant lot. If this purple section were your client, they would be required to do defensible space on this portion to provide that defensible space for the neighboring structure. Quick view of our inspection software. Our maps are not surveyor level. We use county and town provided GIS parcel maps. And if any of you have ever worked with that sort of data, there are some inherent issues. So like I said, it's not surveyor level, but for the most part, we're able to find property corners and identify, property lines. That being said, sometimes you get situations like this. This example is from Kingvale, where we have parcels showing as if they're overlapping the streets across the river. And you'll see that if I was looking at this specific parcel, I'm clearly not looking at the actual location of the parcel according to where the actual property corners are. So we make best efforts to inspect within the property lines, but our information is only as good as what that data that's being provided. So in this sort of situation, we're relying on physical indicators, ideally marked corners. It's the property owner's responsibility to verify what their property boundaries are. If we mark items that are not on a property owner's within the actual boundaries, we are not advising them to do work that is outside of their authority to conduct. There's a margin of error for where we're inspecting and identifying violations. So you can always just give us the feedback that something is not on the lot. Some basics about the report. You should generally consider that the report is representative of work that needs to be completed on the property. So if I take a picture of shrubs that need increased separation and there are 2 pictures, that doesn't mean that there are only 2 instances of that requirement. The principles should be interpreted and applied around the property. This is part of sort of the educational approach that we don't want to be in the line of work of telling people exactly what needs to be done. We want to be teaching our residents what defensible space looks like and enabling them to maintain that sort of thing themselves. And that is part of why these real estate inspections are so important, that a buyer is coming to a property that has been marked compliant. And that means that we want that baseline to look like what compliant actually looks like, what protecting their home and community actually looks like. We do not have an actual certificate of compliance. A compliant report means that you have 0 defensible space items on it. So you access that the same way that you accessed the report when it had 15 items on it. Couple of other things about achieving compliance. Many of you work with contractors. We've recently updated our contractor list. Link here, it's also available on our main website, truckeefire.org/dspace. As you might expect, and hopefully John supports my pseudo lawyer language here in my disclaimer, our contractor list is not supporting, guaranteeing, et cetera, the work. It is ultimately homeowners' responsibility to make sure that they're appropriately licensed. And in the same vein, it's homeowners' responsibility to make sure that they're complying with whatever HOA specific requirements there are in terms of authorization for tree removal and any higher level requirements within their HOA. We just completed a contractor training that is geared towards our tree service and defensible space professionals. If you guys work with anyone, whether they are licensed or not, whether they're, staff from your usual construction team or your cleanup team or your handyman, I would encourage you to have them watch the portion of the video that's specifically about our common findings so that they understand what we're looking for. Some contractors are now offering guaranteed compliance. So they are providing an estimate for the work itself for bringing the property into compliance. And we have seen that work out well for everyone involved. The contractor is, committed to doing a thorough and complete job, and there aren't surprises in cost for anyone when if they need to come back and do some additional work. Lastly, one thing I see a lot in terms of moving towards compliance is that defensible space contractors might not take ownership of some findings that are sort of outside of their wheelhouse, which might be moving lumber, moving combustibles that are stored around the house, and updating address numbers. Those are items that are required to be done in order to achieve compliance that sometimes end up falling to the real estate professional or the homeowner to make sure that those are complete. A lot of you have seen that we've had changes to our user interface. And one of those changes is that the printed report is now limited to a maximum of 2 photos per finding. So we were already encouraging it, but now more than ever, really anyone that is responsible for doing defensible space work on a property should be accessing the online version, not just the printed report. After the work has been conducted, the owner or their representative will need to either schedule a reinspection or submit photos for resolution. Most properties at present are going to need an in-person reinspection. And this is because, you guys don't want to take that many pictures for photo resolution. And it can be very hard on a heavily vegetated property to determine from a photo what work has been completed versus what, was required. We'll usually identify on the inspection report if it's eligible for photo resolution. And generally those are going to be situations where the rest of the property is very well maintained. There are just a couple of specific findings rather than that situation where the photo is representative of the work needing to be done. Speaking of photo resolution, if you are submitting photos, it is going to be easiest for us to resolve things when you're taking the photo from the same angle as the evaluation photo. So a couple of examples: combustibles that were stored under the deck, and their picture very clearly identifies that they've been removed. Trees that needed limbing, picture is from the same angle. It is very easy for the inspector that's reviewing the submissions to confirm that the limbs that were identified were in fact removed. An example of photos that do not help us resolve are a situation like this, where there was a lot of tree thinning that was required and the photo doesn't capture that area at all. So in this situation, even if you do submit a ton of photos, if we can't make the resolution, determination based on the photos, then we will just let you know that you're going to have to go ahead and submit a request for a full follow-up inspection. All right, navigating the online report. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but there are a couple of changes that I want to share with you. So pardon me while I switch which screen I'm sharing here. All right, there is a relatively new feature that allows you to create a login. And I would strongly recommend, this is basically made for you guys that are managing multiple properties. Generally, when you access the report, defensiblespacereport.org/Truckee, you're going to enter a property address and the access code that we provide. Now you can create a login. And once you have a login, you can maintain a list of properties. When you create the login, you now do not need to enter the address and access code every single time you access that property. You can maintain them all here and then click in to view the reports of each one. When you are done representing the property, you can delete it to remove it from your list. Once you have the property associated with your login here, you will get notifications when there is an inspection update. Once you are within a property, let me go to the other one. This is our firehouse. So it's where we have lots of test inspections. This is where I told you guys you'll be able to see a note if we enter that something is eligible for photo resolution, the date of the last inspection, and whether it was full access. Primarily, you're going to be looking at the defensible space page. This is going to indicate if there are multiple, let me turn my, oh, can't do my laser on that one. Let me switch again. You will have the ability to view multiple photos in here. You should click into details. You'll be able to flip through multiple photos, view inspector notes, and then this is also where you can go to submit resolution. If we have a photo, it will show here and you'll be able to align the accompanying photo so you can make sure that it's from the same angle. Downloading and printing. This has been a sort of challenging point throughout the life of this user interface, but at present, in order to print the report, you should download the full report as PDF and then print it like you would any other PDF. That's accessible through here. And I think I covered everything that I wanted to on that. Okay, last thing that I'm going to cover before kicking it over to Paul and Eric for our off-season inspections. We mentioned before that the code does allow for an exception in confirming compliance or in obtaining the inspection. If the weather does not permit an inspection to be obtained, then basically the buyer needs to take responsibility for getting that taken care of. And when the weather allows, they'll need to schedule that inspection and then, complete the work within that appropriate time period. We're working on a system to notify recent buyers that their property still does not reflect a compliant report. So you guys can expect that sort of communication to be coming to your recent buyers in the next couple of months. I see John has a question. So before I pass it over to Eric, my manager, I will see if I can answer John's question.
Thank you. Actually, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much to you and to Truckee Fire for being so transparent and doing such an aggressive outreach program to us and others in the community to ensure that what your expertise is in the area of wildfire prevention and suppression is matched by our expertise in areas that you're not as familiar with, like, land sales and things of that nature, and escrow being time sensitive. So I really appreciate that. I did want to say, just because I know that we are going to talk about Tahoe Donner, please be aware, as realtors on the call, that HOAs are, as you know, private entities, right? You voluntarily agree to subscribe to their CC&Rs when you move in, and they vary wildly. So what you hear today from Tahoe Donner is actually, I think it's a really good, aggressive, thinning program throughout the development. That's just my opinion. But nonetheless, do not expect every HOA encumbered property to have similar or even nearly in the same universe as Tahoe Donner's. And then the question I had is the good neighbor clause. I get it. I respect it in terms of defensible space being only as good as everyone else's compliance. But how far do you take the good neighbor clause? Because, of course, as an individual who's either trying to ready their property for sale and be in compliance, or an individual who just in good faith wants to get that certification, even though they have no intention of selling, but the real problem is outside the boundary of their property line, and they have no right nor responsibility or ability to get on that property, much less comply or compel compliance. So
Yeah.
if
Thank you
someone
for,
is a
that's an
bad actor,
important clarifying.
okay?
Yeah, that's an important clarifying question. Thanks for raising that, John. So the good neighbor clause that I'm referring to is on my property. If John's 100 feet of defensible space, basically, if defensible space zone does not know property lines, the same way that fire does not know property lines. So if John's 100 feet of defensible space zone overlaps my property, then I'm responsible for that portion that falls on my property. As opposed to John being responsible for work on my property. So we're not telling anyone to do work outside of their own property. It's rather that their obligation to fulfill those defensible space requirements extends to protecting their neighboring structures as well.
So
Does that clarify, John?
Sort of. So let's say I do comply and you are a bad actor. I like that better than the other way around. And so let's say that I am selling my home and I'm in a time-sensitive escrow. It might take you 8 months, and you might have to even pull a lien on that property and force the work to be done. Are you going to delay the transfer of my title?
The inspection of your property is limited to what you have control over within your property lines.
So you will deliver me a certificate of compliance within my property line, and that will allow my sale to move forward unencumbered.
Correct. Inspection of your neighbor's property does not influence, from the fire district, does not influence your compliant report.
Perfect. Thank you.
Insurance providers might have a different answer for that, but from the Truckee Fire District compliance perspective, correct. You are only required to act upon what you have control over within your property boundaries. Thank you for that clarifying question.
Thank you.
I think a lot of other questions came up. I'd like to give Eric just a couple minutes to talk about a couple of other pertinent items that we wanted to address with this group, and then pass it to Paul, the representative from Tahoe Donner, to talk about the Tahoe Donner specific requirements. And Sue, if it's okay with you, we'll do that and then open up to questions. You're on mute, Sue, sorry.
So I think it might be a good idea to do a little Q&A with you guys, since it seems like Tahoe Donner's may be quite different from yours. Answer all the questions after Eric's done, and then we'll watch Tahoe Donner, and then they can ask questions about Tahoe Donner. Would that work?
That's great. Yes.
Okay.
So let me get into my slide deck here. I made a lot of beautiful slides for myself, and then I made this slide for Eric.
Thanks,
So
Moran.
I'll pass it over to Eric to cover some insurance items. And Eric, let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide, which is also just text. Sorry.
All good. Well, thanks, Maria, and thanks for everyone here for giving us the opportunity to jump on and provide some more info and also answer all these questions. We understand this defensible space piece with AB 38 and all the variable defensible space ordinances, depending on what state you're in, what county you're in, what fire district you're in, what HOA you may be in, can be cumbersome to juggle during a transaction. So I think it's been summarized pretty well for this group, and any questions, please bring them up so we can help try to bring some clarity to it while you have us here on this call, or shoot us a call or email after too. So one thing we've really done at Truckee Fire is since the passing of the Safer from Wildfire Insurance Program, we've really tied our defensible space inspections to that as well. For those of you that have been dealing with insurance and insurance non-renewal, right, we had a massive wave of insurance non-renewal in 2018 and 2019 after the Tubbs and Camp fires. And we're in another wave of insurance non-renewals after the passing of Safer from Wildfires Insurance Program. So it was actually a double-edged sword. It was intended to be passed to give homeowners insurance discounts for property level mitigations. And it's actually turned into kind of a heightened response of what mitigation should be done on properties to achieve insurability. So we've made sure that our defensible space inspections, help. We have over 80% of homes within our Truckee Fire District are in a fire-wise community. Truckee Fire is recently approved on the Board of Forestry's fire risk reduction community list. This shows that our local fire district is meeting and exceeding best practices for wildfire mitigation planning and implementation in our community. So 2 good community discounts. And then all of these no-brainers, as we call them, are the basic structure hardening and defensible space things that should be disclosed, should be upgraded, and should be in place. This is what people need, right? A Class A roof. Thankfully, we have mostly composition asphalt or metal roofs in this area. Zone 0 is super easy to do. It's just removing vegetation and combustible items within 5 feet of a structure. The no gate or attached fence is a real issue during a wildfire. And so this is a new standard for insurance, is that you can no longer have an attached combustible gate or fence to your structure. So you got to break that wick of where fire could ignite a fence and wick it towards your structure. Another one we've seen is no combustible sheds or unpermitted outbuildings within 30 feet of a structure. So that means moving those old tough sheds and things like that out to zone 2, like where the firewood should be. Keeping the underneath of decks clean. This is also super, super critical in this area, especially with these decks that are lower to the surface. Of course, PRC 4291 compliance, multi-pane windows, which are really common up here because of our cold climate. Enclosed eaves, this one's not possible for a lot of property owners to even do. Vents are super good to upgrade and an easy one to do. And then another one is the 6 inches of clearance from ground to siding. So making sure you have actually 6 inches of exposed cement foundation where our foundation is. So just wanted to let you know that we're doing our due diligence as a fire agency to align our defensible space practices with insurance. So hopefully this is helping you all out, right? If we have this proactive homeowner that is meeting all these requirements prior to listing and selling their home, if that goes through a conventional mortgage system through title, hopefully that means that they're already meeting what they need to meet to attain insurance, which we don't want insurance to be, another deal breaker for you all. Let's jump to the next slide. Cool. Some other updates here is that we have some stuff going on here at Truckee Fire, much like other fire districts do all around California. And these are the 2 big ones I just wanted to throw out to this group. One, Truckee Fire is mid-process updating a defensible space ordinance. Our current local defensible space ordinance was from 2012, so it's getting a little old. We need to get it with the times, make it more clear to understand all these requirements of what needs to be done. This is still really in a preliminary draft phase. We're working with our close stakeholder agencies, counties, TSBOR. So John's been really monumental in representing TSBOR and you all here through this ordinance update process. And we plan this summer to make sure this ordinance goes out to the public, available for review. And then ultimately it has multiple board meetings that have to take place. It actually has to be ratified by both counties, the town of Truckee, and have 2 public readings at a Truckee Fire board meeting. So by no means is this going to be, tucked under the rug or anything like that. We want to make sure this new defensible space ordinance is very transparently put out to the public so you guys can see what we're looking at. We're not really looking for anything crazy or novel. We really are just trying to bring together the state requirements, best practices, and have a very clean regulatory document that we can use to communicate what needs to be done in our community. The other one is fire prevention cost recovery. This is becoming everly more common in California, is that fire departments and fire districts end up charging cost recovery for fire prevention services that they do. So typically this would be related to commerce, right? We're talking about new construction, business license inspections, plan review. And one of those might be is that we might be looking at updating our cost recovery fee schedule at Truckee Fire, understanding what may or may not need to be charged. And we're thinking that the property sale defensible space inspections could be something that we consider as a fire prevention cost recovery style of inspection. So I'm just throwing that out there. This might not happen. We'll make sure that, we keep John and this group informed on that. The real goals of this is one, this is an unfunded mandate from the state for us to do these defensible space inspections during property sale for AB 38. And really my goal as your local fire district is I want to make sure that we can provide the best level of service as we can to our professional community. So having that cost recovery piece in, it would be reasonable. We're thinking, maybe $100, $150 for an inspection, but that would let us have, long-term dedicated full-time year-round position that their 100% effort is property sale support. So just something I wanted to throw out there so you were all in the loop on that. I will make sure that John Falk and this group is aware if any of this is ever being pursued further, and that we talk with you all before we ever even pursue taking it to our fire district board for review or any sort of approval there. Other than that, I will hang tight for questions and answers, and Maria and I will tag team as many of these can to support the fire district's perspective. So, John, Jana, jump in too as needed if we're missing things as well, and then we'll go over to Tahoe Donner so we can dive into the local CC&Rs that Tahoe Donner has going on.
Okay, great. So Maria, could you stop sharing your screen? And we can I can go through all these. All right, you got several in the chat and also somebody with their hand up. If you want to go through the chat ones. Can you see those, Maria?
Yes, I can.
Do you want me to read them, or you want to read them and answer?
What I might actually do is have my colleagues, Brittany, who is on here since she's been reviewing the questions, maybe pipe up and read out so we don't get too much duplication. And in the meantime, maybe Krista wants to unmute and pose her question while we sort of get ourselves in line to answer the chat questions as well.
Krista, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, I did. Thank you. Thanks, Maria. So I made some very scribbly notes that are hard for me to read, so bear with me while you guys were talking. So I'm from a Truckee Fire family, and I'm on the summit. I'm on Donner Summit. I have Serene Lakes Realty. I've always been in favor of obtaining clearance, and I think it's an excellent program and a clear incentive for people to get clearance and perform defensible space work. The custom has generally been over the last, some odd years that in the summertime, it becomes the seller's responsibility to get the clearance because we're able to access the property. You guys are able to see the property and perform inspections. In the wintertime, it's been generally the buyer's responsibility to get to, take onus for compliance after the sale because we're not able to even do inspections. And I'm happy to lean into my clients, my sellers, to pay for that and get that stuff done. So I'm in favor of that. I fear the custom changing though, and here's why. Up until last year, it's been a relatively navigable process. And last summer, it's become a bit more difficult, and there have been repeat inspections, new findings on subsequent inspections, which have been difficult to navigate, and such as, for example, needles that have fallen between the time the vendor leaves and you guys come back. That's really hard for us to do anything about, because the vendor is set for a certain day. You know, they have a work schedule. You know, you guys have your own schedule, so we can't have someone out there, you know, the day before you guys get back for a re-inspect. It's just not feasible. And then there's a new finding where you know have to come back again, and we have to have the vendor out again. Obviously, there's a time period of the year in which there might be, you know, in 2 or 3 days, you might have a whole new dusting of pine needles, and which you would then fail another inspection. So it's kind of become a logistical problem for us. And, you know, from a business perspective, it's become sort of a punitive process. And, you know, there's a lot of hours dealing with defensible space, rescheduling inspections, dealing with cranky vendors, cranky sellers, costs from the original estimate going up from subsequent inspections. There's just too many variables and no longer solid parameters from which to follow.
Yeah, if I could jump in and speak to that, just before you move on to other items, Krista.
Sure.
We do our best to maintain consistency. We try to have one inspector, and that's me, doing the original inspection and the follow-up inspection, so that you're not having a different perspective when we come back to do the inspections. There, as I mentioned, there is a 6-month window of those. You know, a lot can change in 6 months. So depending on when the very original inspection was done, if the contractor is doing work based on something that was, you know, a year old, then something, you know, significant may have changed. It sounds like what you're describing is a situation where it was not a very significant change, and I'm more than happy for you to bring those to my attention and to work through those together. For the most part, when I have failed follow-up inspections, it's items that are very clearly not addressed. And I am always happy to meet a contractor, the realtor, the homeowner at a property to walk through and give better understanding of what we're specifically looking for. That is usually the best way for us to sort of get on the same page. And if, you know, maybe there are hiccups along the way in terms of some contractors who have been doing this work for a very long time, getting familiar with what the current standard is for defensible space requirements, because even though the code has existed for a long time, the degree to which we're inspecting to actually bring properties fully compliant with that code has changed with the capacity that's been brought with Measure T. As to grumpy vendors and grumpy sellers, I can't help with that part, but I am always happy to chat with anybody that you feel like, you know, your sort of playing intermediary is not fulfilling what questions or needs they have. And I would say, you know, on specific inspections, I'm always receptive to, you know, you bringing those to my attention. And if there's something that you feel like, you know, is needle cast from a recent storm versus accumulation that hasn't actually been addressed since the original inspection, then let's chat about it. We do a lot of inspections, and we do our best to, you know, take into consideration all of the factors. And, you know, so we're human. Sometimes we overlook something, or sometimes we identify something that, you know, in communication and upon consideration of other, circumstances, we're comfortable to remove.
Thank
So
you,
I hope
Maria.
that speaks to
Let's-
your question. Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
move on to some of the other questions, and Krista, we can come back to you if you have some more questions. I just want to get through as many as we can before we go on to Tahoe Donner. So let's do the chat. Are you all right with that, Maria?
So as we have been going, John and Eric have been answering some questions in the chat. So thank you both for that. There are a couple that I want to come back to. One was asked by Jesse Fiddler. Do all dead trees get tagged? Recently got an inspection done. There were 2 dead trees that weren't marked, but other trees were.
Yeah, great question. Tahoe Donner's inspections are including a forestry overall perspective, and Paul will speak more about that. So they do tag trees. Truckee Fire does not tag or identify trees that are required for removal. The standard is that any dead tree within 100 feet of a structure needs to be removed.
Yeah, and then to add to that, as soon as you get into the Lake Tahoe Basin, dead trees do not require a TRPA permit to be removed, but any live trees greater than 14 inches measured at the diameter at breast height do require a TRPA permit to be removed. We also have numerous HOAs in Truckee and in Tahoe where an architect review committee or an HOA member may require a permit for tree removal as well. I know this comes up in the Sierra Meadows HOA, Tahoe Donner, and some other locations. So it is, when you get into trees, it is important to reach out, either to fire district, HOA, make sure you're understanding what needs to be done. It definitely can vary.
Right, next.
Great, thank you both. Okay, Yvette had a question. If the siding extends to the 6 inches from ground zone, would fire resistant wainscoting be an acceptable modification?
Yeah, absolutely.
You are muted.
Yes,
Maria,
absolutely.
Hold on, Maria, just jumping into this one. So actually the answer is no. Building code requires typically 4 to 8 inches of siding exposure, depending on where you live. The siding exposure piece is really related to water intrusion to a house. So if there is siding within 6 inches of the ground, you should see this come up on 1, the property inspection, and then 2, a defensible space inspection. We care about it from fire because if pine needles and leaves from those lame little wind events we get all fall long, like Krista mentioned, accumulate next to the siding, leaves and pine needles produce about a 4-inch flame length. So if we can have a 6-inch gap from the ground up to where the siding starts, then we don't have to worry about fire potentially penetrating up into underneath of the sheathing, which on all of our old homes is typically tar paper, which creates a pathway where fire can enter right into the stud cavity of a house and move its way up through the stud cavity and siding. So that's kind of an interesting one, is that no, even with wainscoting, you would still actually need that 6-inch foundation exposure. The only place where we wouldn't really look at this is if you get into like very modern construction where everything's non-combustible and you're talking like cement stem walls coming up, 3, 6, 12 feet from the ground, metal clad siding, faceted to cement stem walls, we're going to turn on that's very non-combustible. It was built to the new WUI building standards. That's fine. There's not an issue for us to catch for fire, and there's not going to be an issue likely for your normal inspection to catch anything from that water intrusion standpoint.
That's why he's the boss.
Brittany, do you have anything else that hasn't been answered?
No, I believe all of the other questions have been answered. So unless anyone has any additional questions that they want to either raise their hand for real quick or pop into the chat, I believe I'll hand it back over to Maria, who will likely hand it over to Paul with Tahoe Donner.
Krista, did you have anything else to add? I'm sorry I had to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure everybody got a chance.
I was almost finished, but I think I gather from Maria's comment that you're open to working with us when there's some common sense type issues that pop up. I would just like to avoid having the re-inspections because that's a new thing for us, and it logistically it's really hard trying to navigate that, and also finding new issues in a new inspection. You think you're dealing with A and then it turns out to be B. That becomes really hard. And even if it is, the same person doing the inspection, one of the comments that was made, I think, was that we should look at this as a guideline and not a definitive list of things that need to be done. And I don't think that's the right approach.
Great.
Y-
Yeah, and
Esther, I
I'm
think
sure
Beth's
Maria's
thing is, oh,
fine.
I was
I'm
just
sorry,
gonna say, I
Maria,
think
you're
Beth-
fine to talk with Krista. She can email you or call you directly about that. And then,
absolutely.
yeah, if you guys want to move on to who's next up? Is it Paul, right?
Yeah, Paul is going to speak specifically about Tahoe Donner requirements.
Hey guys, how are you? My name is Paul Salmon Hidalgo, and I'm with Tahoe Donner Forestry. And thank you, Truckee Fire and Tahoe Sierra Board of Realtors for inviting us. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our procedures and specifics. And the first thing that I want to say, referring to the conversation that we were having, is that like we have been given authority to take care of these AB 38 inspections, and this has also to do with our CCNRs, but also because of all the historical data that we hold in each of these private lots. And like there might be differences in measurement specifics. Like for example, zone 0 for Truckee Fire is 5 feet from the structure, and for Tahoe Donner that's 10 feet from the structure. And in cases like this, you will see that reflected on the report. So in each of those issues items, you will see that measurement. And two important differences to note also are that for us, the responsibility for the homeowner to complete the work is within the boundaries. So basically, it's 100 feet from the structure and 100 feet from the boundary in. And that basically translates to the whole lot just because of the size of the lots here at Tahoe Donner. Another big difference Maria mentioned is that we tag trees. So we will tag trees with orange flagging, trees that are alive, and we will use spray paint for dead trees. So yeah, those are the three important things to take into consideration. And answering a little bit with Krista's talk. We want to be fair with you, and we understand that if we put something on the report, if we change it in the future, that's kind of not fair, right? And it happens sometimes, as Maria mentioned, that a tree dies after the inspection happened, and we will not be putting this tree in your inspection. We will not hold your business because there is a new dead tree. However, Tahoe Donner has a specific program for dead trees, and that will trigger another different program, which will not be related to AB 38 and will not hold your business. Okay, just wanted to make this clear. And regarding the pine needles, this is yearly maintenance, and it does happen sometimes that you go in between seasons and there was some snow on the ground and now we can see the whole lot. Or it may happen that you did rake, but perhaps you didn't accomplish the 10 feet. So that's why there's a new picture, and that's why it might look that there is more stuff, but yeah, just some points to make them clear. And yeah, I just want to thank you everybody, for your efforts. Last year, I think that we inspected 300 properties for real estate, and about half of those got compliancy on the first six months, which means that new homeowners came in with full defensible space done and with their lot looking, like it should. And like that's great, because that means that the new homeowners see the way that they have to maintain the lot for the future. And when you are selling properties here, you can let potential buyers know that they are buying property into a community that prioritizes human lives, people's assets, as well as the environment, and that is awesome, I think. And we value a lot your work, and that is why we're thinking about how can we help you guys out a little bit here. How can we try to move your business forward faster instead of holding it. And we realized that a bunch of time is lost into, like the processing of what's coming for inspection and the processing of inspections that have been done and the communication. So that is why we're trying to have everyone send requests through our website so that you are put into a first come first serve list. And that is why after we finish your inspection, we're aiming to send you an automatic email that will let you know that that's done. So in order to do so, what we have worked this winter is to get all of our contact information in our association database synced into our defensible space report, software. And in order to move even a step forward on this, we are using your emails as realtors and adding them onto this account, these addresses that you are requesting an inspection for, so that you also receive an automatic email, if that makes sense. So once we are out there, we inspect and we're done, an automatic email will go to the homeowner, to the current owner, as well as you. And the only thing that we need you to do is to make sure that you submit your request for inspection through our website. And if you don't have that saved on your desktop yet, just go to Google and type Tahoe Donner Defensible Space, click on the first link, and then you will see a blue square that says request inspection, defensible space inspection. Click there and just fill up that, and yeah, we'll receive a request. Another point that I wanted to talk about is how to achieve that compliancy right away, right? And I think that the best practice to do that is, if you have a contractor, make sure that they understand that they have to find the correct property corner, and that they shoot a line, that goes to the front of the property, and that they flag it. We make sure that all our properties have their back property corners marked for reasons like this. And if they mark that line, it will be much easier for them to make sure that they are completing the work through the whole lot. So that's one. And the second one is, before they leave the job site, they should take the report, read the items, and make sure that they have completed all of them. And if they do these two things, I'm almost certain that they will get a compliancy. And yeah, that's all I wanted to really talk about. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Right. Thanks, Paul. Does anybody have any questions for Tahoe Donner, for Paul? I'm looking for any hands raised or anything in the chat. All right, anybody have anything else for anybody else who's still here? Any last questions? We will be posting this to the website. We'll put out a notification for you to link for you to find it. And that's all I had. If anybody else have any closing comments? All right.
Since we have time, sorry, Sue, since we have time, I'll share a couple of more things that might be insightful. First, I will just share my screen for everybody to see the easiest way to access everything on truckeefire.org/dspace. If you scroll down here, inspections for property sale, we have the link to the Truckee Fire District inspections and directly to Tahoe Donner's defensible space, real estate inspections. So if you want to just save one, that gives you a quick jump to all of them. And links for all of the websites that we've mentioned are going to be in the document that we share and that Sue links to on the TSBOR document or website. One other thing that I wanted to speak to, Paul raised a good point, which is that if, for example, the initial inspection has representative photos of a particular finding, and when we go back for the reinspection, the finding hasn't been addressed all around the property, we might put a new photo to give additional clarification as to other areas that require that mitigation. So the way that the report is structured, it may look like a new finding, but it's the equivalent of us being there and sort of saying, okay, this one also needs that. This one also needs that. And for anyone on here, the way to sort of be sure that you're going to get a compliant follow-up inspection is to meet me for the initial inspection. For you as the realtor to meet me, or the contractor that's going to be doing the work to meet me. And then I can be a lot more specific about pointing out the areas and making sure that there's clear understanding about what work needs to be done across the entire property versus ones where the photo itself is specifically capturing. I don't think that any of you or your contractors want to be reviewing a report that has a photo capturing each shrub that needs work. On some properties, it's not tenable because it gets to a point where you can't identify each shrub to the corresponding photo, and the instruction of apply around the property is ultimately what becomes implemented anyway. So I hope that gives some clarification as to the instruction to apply a finding around the property and why something might seem like a new finding when it's really just a clarification on something that wasn't fully mitigated the first time around.
All right. Thank you, Maria, and thanks to everyone who attended. I'm going to go ahead and end this and stop the recording. And